You're driving like you always do, the engine feels normal, the car pulls fine, the steering feels the same, and then you glance down and the needle is dead. 0. Or it wakes up, drops out, jumps around, and you start doing mental math with traffic flow just to avoid getting flashed by a speed camera. If you searched speedometer not working on Suzuki Swift, the frustrating part is that the car can feel perfectly healthy while the speed signal is completely missing. And that's where people waste money and they replace a sensor that isn't even used on their version of the Swift, or they buy a whole instrument cluster because the gauge must be bad, and nothing changes. The tricky truth is that speedometer not working isn't one problem. It's a symptom that can be caused by different systems depending on the Swift's configuration and the exact failure mode. Some Swifts get vehicle speed from a transmission vehicle speed sensor. Others effectively borrow speed from the ABS wheel speed sensors through the ABS module and ECU. And even when the source is correct, the signal still has to survive wiring, connectors, grounds, and the cluster's own electronics. So the only way to fix this without guessing is to prove where the speed signal disappears. Start with what not working actually means, because that changes the diagnosis immediately. If the speedometer is completely dead all the time, ask yourself 2 quick questions. First, does the odometer still count miles or kilometers? Second, do you have warning lights like ABS, traction control, or a check engine light? Those 2 details are like a shortcut through a maze. If the speedometer is dead but the odometer still counts, that often points away from a total cluster power failure. It suggests the cluster is alive and receiving some data, but the speed display path is failing, or the cluster is interpreting the signal incorrectly. If both speedometer and odometer are dead, that can mean the cluster isn't receiving any speed data at all, or the cluster has lost power or ground, or there's a communication issue depending on the generation. If the speedometer is intermittent, works when cold and dies when warm, or cuts out over bumps, that screams connection, wiring, or a component that fails with heat. Corrosion in a connector, a harness rubbing through near the gearbox or strut, or a cracked solder joint inside the cluster can all behave like that. If the needle jumps or reads nonsense, that can be a noisy signal, a failing sensor, a damaged tone ring, wheel bearing play affecting an ABS sensor gap, or even low system voltage making the cluster glitch. A wrong tire size won't make it drop to 0, it just makes it inaccurate. Total failure is almost always signal loss, not calibration. Now, before you touch tools, do the fastest triage that actually changes the odds. Look at the dash when you turn the key on. Do the warning lights come on briefly and then go out like normal? If the ABS light stays on, or traction control stays on, that's not just another problem. On many cars, an ABS fault can directly affect the speed signal that the cluster uses. People ignore that light and chase the speedometer itself, when the car is basically telling you, I can't trust wheel speed. Next, think about what happened right before the speedometer died. Battery replaced. Jump start. Alternator issues. Water leak. Work done near the gearbox, suspension, or brakes. A low battery or a bad alternator can cause clusters to behave strangely, but it usually comes with other weirdness, dimming lights, multiple warning lamps, resets, or gauges acting possessed. If everything else is stable and only speed is gone, you're more likely dealing with a missing speed signal than a general electrical collapse. Then do the boring check that people either skip or do incorrectly, fuses. Not just one fuse. The speed signal path can involve the instrument cluster fuse, ECU fuse, and ABS fuse. A blown ABS fuse can kill the ABS module and, depending on the design, remove the speed data source. A blown cluster fuse can make the whole panel dead, but if only the speedometer is dead, fuses are less likely. Still, it's quick and it's worth doing properly. Check with a test light or meter, not just by looking, because hairline brakes can fool you. After that, the single most powerful step is scanning the car. Not because you need fancy dealer equipment, but because live data tells you whether the car knows its speed even if the gauge doesn't. Here's the key idea, there are 2 different questions. Is the vehicle speed signal being generated? And is it being displayed? If you plug in an OBD scanner that can show live data, look for a parameter called vehicle speed. Some scanners call it VSS. If your scanner and your Swift support it, also look for individual wheel speeds. Then do a short, safe roll in a parking lot or on a quiet road and watch the numbers. If the scanner shows vehicle speed increasing normally while the speedometer stays at 0, that's a huge clue. It means the ECU is receiving speed data. The problem is likely between the ECU/communication network and the instrument cluster, or inside the cluster itself. That's when replacing a wheel sensor or a transmission sensor is usually a waste. If the scanner shows zero vehicle speed even while you're moving, then the car itself isn't seeing speed. Now you're looking at the source, a vehicle speed sensor on the transmission, an ABS wheel speed sensor issue, an ABS module issue, or wiring/power to those components. If wheel speeds are available and one wheel reads zero while the others read normally, that points strongly to that wheel sensor, wiring, or tone ring. If all wheel speeds read normally but vehicle speed is still zero, that can indicate a processing or communication problem. The ABS module may see wheel speeds, but the ECU isn't getting a vehicle speed value, or the cluster isn't. That's rarer, but it's exactly why live data is so valuable. Now let's talk about how the Suzuki Swift typically gets speed, without getting lost in model year rabbit holes. In many vehicles, especially older or simpler configurations, there's a vehicle speed sensor mounted on the transmission or gearbox. It reads rotation and sends a pulse signal. If that sensor fails, you can lose speedometer and odometer together, and sometimes you'll get shifting issues on automatics because the transmission control logic cares about speed. On manual cars, you might not feel anything except the dead speedometer. In other configurations, especially where ABS is present and integrated, the car already has wheel speed sensors at the hubs. The ABS module reads them constantly. The vehicle speed can be calculated from those wheel speeds and then shared with the ECU and cluster. In that setup, a single wheel sensor failure can cause ABS and traction lights, and it can also affect the speedometer depending on how the system is designed to fail safely. Some cars will still show speed using the remaining wheels, others will drop the speed signal entirely because it can't guarantee accuracy. That's why the same symptom on two different Swifts can have different causes. And it's why the diagnostic order matters more than the part you think is common. So here's a practical decision path you can follow, and it's the one that prevents the classic mistake, buying parts before you've proven the signal is missing. When you're at the point of speedometer not working on Suzuki Swift, the first fork in the road is, do you have ABS/traction warning lights? If yes, treat that as your primary lead. Scan for ABS codes if your scanner can access the ABS module. Even if it can't, a persistent ABS light plus a dead speedometer is enough to justify inspecting wheel speed sensors and their wiring first. Wheel sensors live in a harsh environment: water, salt, heat, vibration. The wiring flexes with steering and suspension movement. Connectors can corrode. And the sensor tip can get contaminated with metallic debris depending on design. A quick visual inspection can reveal a lot. Look behind each wheel at the sensor wire routing. Is it clipped properly, or is it rubbing the tire? Is it stretched tight? Any obvious cuts, crushed sections, or repairs? Check the connector. Does it look wet, green, or packed with dirt? If you disconnect it, do it gently and look for bent pins or corrosion. Cleaning and reseating a connector won't fix a dead sensor, but it can fix an intermittent dropout that's been driving you crazy. If you can safely lift the car and spin a wheel by hand, some sensors will generate a measurable signal. Depending on sensor type, you might measure AC voltage, frequency, or a digital signal. Many modern wheel speed sensors are active sensors that need power and ground and output a digital signal, so a simple resistance test may not tell you much. But you can still check basics. Is the sensor getting supply voltage? Is ground solid? Is there continuity from the sensor connector back into the harness? If you find no power where there should be, you're no longer blaming the sensor, you're chasing a wiring or module power issue. Also pay attention to wheel bearings. Excessive play can change the sensor gap or damage the tone ring, causing erratic readings. That can show up as a speedometer that works until you turn, or works until you hit a bump, then drops out. People replace sensors repeatedly when the real issue is mechanical movement at the hub. If you don't have ABS lights, or your Swift doesn't have ABS, the likely source shifts toward a transmission vehicle speed sensor and its wiring, or toward the cluster itself. Again, live data is your friend. If vehicle speed on the scanner is zero, you're hunting the source. If it's normal, you're hunting the display path. Let's say the scanner shows zero speed. On a transmission sensor setup, the sensor is usually mounted on the gearbox housing. The common failures are simple: the sensor itself fails, the connector gets oil-soaked or brittle, the wiring chafes, or the sensor gear or pickup is damaged. Sometimes the sensor is fine but the harness has been tugged during other work. A careful inspection around the gearbox can reveal a wire that's been rubbing on a bracket or a connector that isn't fully seated. If you have a multimeter and basic access, you can check whether the sensor has the correct supply voltage and ground. If it's a 2-wire passive sensor, you might see an AC signal when the wheels rotate and the drivetrain turns. If it's a 3-wire sensor, it likely needs a reference voltage and outputs a pulse signal. The exact numbers vary, so don't get hung up on expecting a specific voltage reading as proof of life. The goal is simpler: confirm that power and ground exist, and confirm that some kind of changing signal appears when the car is moving or when the drivetrain is turning in a controlled, safe way. If you can't safely test it dynamically, don't improvise. A safe road test with a scanner watching live data is often the best dynamic test you can do without lifting anything. Now, if the scanner shows normal vehicle speed but the gauge is dead, the problem is downstream. That's where people get tempted to buy a cluster. Sometimes they're right, but you still want to prove it. First, check whether other cluster functions are normal. Do the tachometer, fuel gauge, temperature gauge, backlighting, and warning indicators behave normally. If the entire cluster is flaky, you might have a power or ground issue. Grounds are underrated. A slightly loose or corroded ground can cause weird, selective failures because the cluster's internal electronics are sensitive to voltage drops. If you've ever seen a car where turning on headlights makes gauges move, you've seen a ground problem. If everything else is perfect and only speed is missing, consider communication. On some setups, the cluster doesn't get a raw sensor signal, it gets speed over a data network. If that network message isn't arriving, the ECU might still know speed, but the cluster doesn't. That can be caused by wiring issues in the network, a module fault, or the cluster's own communication circuit. There's also the possibility of an internal cluster fault, stepper motor issues, cracked solder joints, or failed components. Intermittent speedometer operation that changes with temperature or vibration is a classic cluster solder joint story. The needle might work for weeks, then die, then come back after a pothole. That's not a sensor magically healing, that's a connection making contact again. Before you condemn the cluster, do one more sanity check: does the odometer change when you drive? If the odometer increments but the needle doesn't move, that points more strongly to a gauge drive issue inside the cluster rather than missing speed data. If neither changes but the ECU shows speed on the scanner, then the cluster isn't receiving or processing the speed message. Now, let's talk about the mistakes that cost the most money. The first is assuming a dead speedometer always means the instrument cluster is bad. Clusters do fail, but they're not the default villain. They're just the most visible part, so they get blamed first. The second is replacing a vehicle speed sensor without confirming your Swift actually uses that sensor for the speedometer. Depending on the variant, the speed display may be derived from ABS wheel speeds. If you replace a transmission sensor on a car that's using ABS data, you can spend time and money and still have a dead speedometer, because you never touched the real source. The third is ignoring ABS and traction lights. Those lights are not extra. They're often the breadcrumb trail to the missing speed signal. The fourth is stopping after checking fuses. A fuse check is a start, not a diagnosis. If the fuse is fine, you still need to know whether the car sees speed in live data. And the fifth is buying random parts that fit Swift without matching connector type, sensor type, and the car's actual configuration. Even within the same model name, there can be differences in sensors and modules. The part that fits physically might not be the part that speaks the right electrical language. So what are the most common real-world fixes, once you've proven the fault? If the car shows an ABS fault and one wheel speed is missing, the fix is often at that corner: a wheel speed sensor replacement, a wiring repair, or cleaning and reseating a connector. Sometimes it's the tone ring or bearing issue that's causing the sensor to read erratically. The verification is straightforward: clear codes if appropriate, then confirm all wheel speeds read correctly and the speedometer behaves normally on a controlled drive. If the car shows zero vehicle speed and you've confirmed it uses a transmission speed sensor, the fix is often that sensor or its wiring. Again, verify by watching live data. If vehicle speed comes back on the scanner, the speedometer usually follows unless there's a second issue. If the ECU shows speed but the cluster doesn't, you're in the territory of cluster power/ground, communication, or internal cluster failure. Sometimes simply addressing low system voltage or weak battery connection can stabilize a glitchy cluster, but don't count on that if the failure is consistent. If you suspect the cluster, professional repair can be an option, because many cluster faults are reparable at the board level. The important part is that you only go there after you've proven the speed data exists elsewhere. And if you're stuck because your scanner can't read ABS data, you can still make progress. The presence of ABS and traction lights, combined with a speedometer failure, still points you toward wheel sensors and ABS power. A basic inspection and checking ABS-related fuses and connectors can reveal an obvious issue. If nothing is obvious, that's when a shop with a scan tool that can access the ABS module becomes worth it, because it turns guesswork into a specific fault code and a specific wheel or circuit. One more nuance that catches people: intermittent failures caused by water intrusion. If the speedometer dies after heavy rain, a car wash, or humid weather, suspect connectors and harness points where water can sit. Wheel sensor connectors and harness routing points are common. So are areas near the firewall or under dash where moisture can affect the cluster connector. You're not looking for dramatic flooding, even a little moisture plus time can create corrosion that behaves like a switch. Another nuance: if the speedometer fails at the same time as other odd electrical symptoms, don't ignore charging system health. A weak alternator or poor battery connection can cause modules to drop out or throw nonsense codes. You don't need to become an electrical engineer for this. Just be honest about the symptoms. If the car struggles to start, lights flicker, or multiple systems complain at once, check battery terminals, grounds, and charging voltage before you chase a single sensor. Now, if you want a simple way to think about the whole problem, it's this: the speedometer is the last link in a chain. Your job is to find the first link that's broken. The chain starts at a sensor, either at the wheels or the transmission. Then it goes through wiring and connectors. Then it goes through a module that interprets it, like the ABS module or ECU. Then it goes to the cluster, either as a signal wire or as data. And only then does the needle move. When people say, speedometer not working on Suzuki Swift, they're usually standing at the last link, staring at the needle, and guessing which earlier link failed. The calm way through it is to step back and ask, does the car know its speed? If yes, the cluster side is guilty. If no, the sensor side is guilty. And the warning lights and codes tell you which branch to follow. Once you've made the repair, verification matters. Don't just celebrate because the needle moved once. Confirm it stays stable over a few drives, including bumps and turns if it was intermittent. Confirm the odometer counts correctly. If you had ABS or traction lights, confirm they stay off and that codes don't return. If you use live data, check it again. Vehicle speed should be consistent, and wheel speeds should agree with each other during straight line driving. And finally, a practical safety note: driving without a working speedometer isn't just annoying. It increases the chance of speeding without realizing it, and it can hide other issues if the speed signal is used by other systems. If the speedometer failure is paired with ABS warnings, treat it as a reason to be cautious in wet conditions and to get it diagnosed sooner rather than later. The good news is that most cases aren't mysterious once you stop guessing. A dead speedometer can feel like a big, expensive problem because the cluster is right there in your face. But when you follow the signal logically, you usually end up with a small set of likely culprits: a wheel speed sensor or its wiring, a transmission speed sensor or its wiring, an ABS-related fault that blocks speed data, or a cluster issue that only becomes the suspect after you've proven the rest of the chain is alive. That's how you fix it once, instead of paying for the same symptom 3 times.